For 2 decades, the Whitfords lived in a sprawling mansion, admired as the picture of perfection, a wealthy, white Southern family with everything money could buy. But hidden behind those tall iron gates was a secret so dark, even their closest friends never suspected it. In a locked attic room, their black daughter grew up in silence, kept away from the world, her existence erased from family portraits and public life. The Whitfords thought they had buried their shame forever, until she stumbled upon a sealed letter written in her father's trembling hand. The words inside revealed not just a confession, but a truth powerful enough to shatter reputations, tear apart lies, and unleash a storm the world would never forget. The Whitfords had always been the family everyone else whispered about, not out of scandal but out of envy. Their mansion rose above the rolling hills of the south like a crown on the land, white columns gleaming in the sun, surrounded by carefully trimmed gardens that spoke of wealth, discipline, and old money pride. To the outside world, Jonathan and Margaret Whitford had crafted the image of a dynasty rooted in influence and perfection. Their 3 blonde-haired children appeared in every magazine feature about Southern legacy families, their photos spread across glossy covers during gala season, with captions that praised their charm, intelligence, and unshakable elegance. Yet beneath that polished veneer, there existed a silence, an absence that no one dared to question. Guests who strolled through the mansion never saw the locked door on the 3rd floor, hidden at the end of a corridor lined with forgotten portraits. Servants were forbidden to speak of it, and when curious visitors asked about unused rooms in such a vast estate, Margaret brushed it off with a smile. Just storage. Old family heirlooms, but inside that room lived a secret. A child who had grown not in sunlight but in shadows. A daughter never introduced to the world, never photographed for magazines, never allowed to step outside the boundary of the estate. She had been born into the same bloodline, yet branded as different from the very beginning. The story of how she came to be hidden began long before her birth. Jonathan Whitford was a man obsessed with legacy. Raised under the stern gaze of his father, he had been taught that the Whitford name carried an image that could never be tarnished. It wasn't enough to be rich. One had to be untouchable. Appearances were not just important, they were survival. He married Margaret, a woman from an equally respected family, and together they built the perfect facade. To Jonathan, every detail mattered. The way the hedges were clipped, the way his children carried themselves in public, the way Margaret hosted dinners with flawless grace. But one night, a truth emerged that would threaten to dismantle everything. Margaret gave birth to their 4th child. Unlike the others, her skin carried the undeniable mark of black heritage. At first, Jonathan refused to believe it. He raged at the hospital, accused the doctors of mistakes, demanded explanations. But as the days passed, denial gave way to cold calculation. He wasn't a man who allowed emotions to dictate his actions. He was a man who thought in strategies. And so, he made a decision that would haunt him forever. The baby, whom Margaret wanted to hold, nurture, and love openly, was instead declared a family secret. Jonathan convinced her, or perhaps coerced her, that revealing the child to the world would destroy everything they had built. The Whitford legacy, their businesses, their status, their invitations to the exclusive circles of Southern aristocracy, all of it, he said, would come crumbling down if anyone discovered the truth. Margaret, torn between a mother's instinct and her husband's iron will, yielded to his demand. And thus the baby was tucked away in secrecy. She grew up inside the mansion's walls, hidden in a room that overlooked the back garden, but whose curtains were always drawn. She was taught to stay quiet whenever visitors came. Food was brought to her on trays that no servant dared question. Books became her only window to the outside world, while the laughter of her siblings echoed distantly through hallways she was never allowed to walk. She existed in the shadows of her own family, unseen and unacknowledged. Over time, she became adept at noticing things others missed. She noticed how her siblings' pictures adorned the walls in golden frames, while she remained absent from every family portrait. She noticed how Margaret sometimes lingered by her door late at night, torn between the urge to step in and the fear of being caught. She noticed how Jonathan avoided her entirely, as though her existence were a crack in the perfect glass he had worked so hard to polish. The world outside never suspected. Newspapers continued to run stories of the Whitfords' charity events, their political donations, their children excelling at private schools. Behind those headlines, however, the family carried a tension that could never be spoken aloud. Jonathan buried himself in work. Margaret distracted herself with society luncheons, and the children were groomed to embody the legacy without ever knowing they had a hidden sister. But the child, hidden though she was, grew older. Curiosity, after all, cannot be locked away forever. She would press her ear against the door to listen to the footsteps of her siblings, to the murmurs of parties downstairs, to the faint music that drifted through the halls during grand gatherings. Every sound from the outside world became a thread, weaving together her hunger for freedom. As she entered her teenage years, questions began to form. Why was she different? Why was she hidden? Who was she really? Margaret, in moments of quiet rebellion, sometimes whispered fragments of truth, that she was loved, that her existence was a secret only because the world outside was cruel, that one day things might change. But the girl knew half-truths when she heard them. She saw the guilt in her mother's eyes, the fear in her silence, and she understood, perhaps more deeply than anyone intended, that she was not hidden for her protection. She was hidden for theirs. It was during this period of silent awakening that she began searching the mansion for clues. When servants were careless, leaving doors unlocked, she wandered at night, exploring the grand rooms that seemed like palaces compared to her own confinement. She traced her fingers over the polished wood of the family piano, stared at the chandeliers that glittered like constellations, marveled at the gowns in Margaret's wardrobe. Each exploration deepened her longing to belong, but belonging was a privilege denied to her. And every discovery only sharpened the edges of resentment that quietly grew within her. Still, the Whitfords believed their secret was safe. They believed that by locking away the truth, they could control it. What they didn't realize was that secrets have a way of surviving longer than lies. The daughter they had hidden was not just surviving, she was observing, remembering, and waiting. The turning point came when Jonathan's health began to fail. Once a man of unshakable authority, his body began to betray him in his later years. He grew weaker, more withdrawn, spending long hours in his study surrounded by papers and old journals. For the first time, cracks began to show in his perfectly constructed world. With the fear of mortality pressing down on him, he began writing. Letters, confessions, documents, attempts perhaps, to unburden himself from the weight of what he had done. The hidden daughter didn't know it yet, but her father's hand was drafting the very confession that would change everything. It would not only reveal the truth about her birth, but also expose the tangled web of fear, control, and legacy that had dictated her entire life. And when she finally found that letter, when her eyes traced the trembling words of a man who had built an empire on lies, the silence of 20 years would break. But for now, in this stage of her life, she remained the ghost of the Whitford estate, a daughter without a name, hidden from the world, waiting unknowingly for the moment her father's carefully guarded secret would finally unravel. The Whitford mansion, though dazzling from the outside, had grown heavy with shadows. The hidden daughter, now 20 years old, was no longer a passive ghost inside its walls. She had matured in silence, her mind sharpened by books, her spirit tempered by loneliness, and her heart restless with unspoken questions. The confinement that once felt like a prison had slowly transformed into a vantage point. She had seen enough, overheard enough, and pieced together enough fragments to know one undeniable truth. Something about her existence was deliberately being concealed. The secrecy became unbearable. She watched from the attic window, the curtains slightly parted, as her siblings drove off to universities, dressed in tailored suits, carrying the family crest with pride. She listened to the hushed conversations of servants in the kitchen, catching fragments of gossip about inheritance, business deals, and Jonathan's fragile health. She studied Margaret's late-night pacing, the way her mother lingered outside the locked door as though pulled by guilt, yet chained by fear. Her curiosity, no longer content with half answers, began driving her to action. The nights became her domain. When the household slept, she moved quietly through the hallways, careful not to leave traces of her exploration. She had learned to recognize which floorboards creaked, which doors groaned, and how to slip through spaces like a shadow. Her first discoveries were small. In Jonathan's study, she found ledgers filled with names and figures she couldn't decipher, but they hinted at a life ruled by appearances and deals. She discovered photographs stacked in dusty boxes, images of her siblings' birthdays, vacations, galas, none of which included her. Each photo felt like a wound, proof of her erasure, proof that she was deliberately cut out of the narrative of the Whitford family. One night, she uncovered something that made her heart pound. Inside Margaret's closet, hidden behind stacks of gowns, was a small wooden box. Inside lay a baby bracelet engraved with her name, her real name, one she had never been called by in her confinement. It wasn't the nickname whispered by Margaret in stolen moments. It wasn't the silence Jonathan wrapped around her existence. It was hers, carved in silver letters. Seeing it, touching it, made the world tilt. Someone had once intended to acknowledge her, to love her openly. That discovery fueled her determination. The Whitfords, meanwhile, carried on with their public life, oblivious to the storm building within their own home. Jonathan's decline was becoming more obvious. His once commanding presence at galas was now reduced to stiff appearances, his hand trembling as he raised glasses for toasts. Margaret became more frantic in her hosting duties, as though doubling her efforts to cover the cracks in their foundation. The siblings, unaware of their hidden sister, spoke of their futures, careers, and inheritances, secure in their place within the dynasty. But behind closed doors, the atmosphere grew tense. Jonathan spent long hours locked in his study, papers strewn across his desk, a glass of whiskey always half empty beside him. Margaret often argued with him in hushed tones, words like legacy, truth, and too late, slipping through the walls to ears that had learned to listen carefully. The hidden daughter realized something vital. Jonathan was afraid. And fear, in her experience, always left trails. She followed those trails meticulously. One night, while Jonathan slept heavily under the haze of medication, she crept into his study. Rifling through drawers, she found journals, letters sealed and unsealed, and finally, a small stack of envelopes bound with string. Her fingers shook as she untied the bundle. Inside were letters Jonathan had written but never sent. At first they were practical, notes about estate matters, investments, reminders to himself. But as she dug deeper, the letters took on a different tone. They were confessions, words written by a man haunted by choices, though never spoken aloud. One letter in particular caught her breath. It began with, "To the daughter I could never acknowledge." Her eyes blurred as she read. Jonathan confessed the truth of her birth, how he had demanded her concealment, how fear of losing everything had outweighed the courage to accept her. He admitted the guilt that gnawed at him, the sleepless nights, the way her absence had hollowed out the family despite appearances. The words were not apologetic enough to erase 2 decades of pain, but they carried weight, a weight she had longed to see placed on someone other than herself. But before she could finish the letter, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Panicked, she shoved the pages back into the bundle and returned them to their place. Her heart thundered as she slipped back into the shadows of her room, the confession still burning in her mind. She had glimpsed the truth, but not fully, and partial truth is often more dangerous than lies. From that night on, she became consumed with uncovering everything. Every whisper between Margaret and Jonathan, every careless remark from a servant, every locked drawer became part of a puzzle. She realized the confession was not just about her existence. It hinted at something larger, something tied to the Whitford name itself. Jonathan's obsession with legacy wasn't only about appearances. There was something in his past, something buried, that connected to why her birth had been treated as catastrophic. Meanwhile, Jonathan's health spiraled. He grew weaker and his temper shorter. Margaret began carrying the weight of appearances almost alone, her beauty now tinged with exhaustion. The siblings returned home for visits, filling the mansion with their laughter, oblivious to the secret that lingered in the walls. For the hidden daughter, each of their visits was torture. She watched them stroll through halls that had denied her, sit at tables she had never been invited to, bask in a love that had been systematically stolen from her. The resentment that had quietly grown for years now erupted into rage. She no longer wanted just answers. She wanted to shatter the lie. One evening, after a family gathering ended and the guests departed, she slipped into the dining hall. The remnants of the party glittered under candlelight. Half-empty wine glasses, silver trays of untouched food, roses beginning to wilt. She imagined herself walking in during the dinner, revealing who she was, demanding recognition. The image fueled her, but she also knew timing mattered. A storm had to break at the right moment to leave the most destruction. The right moment came sooner than expected. Jonathan collapsed in his study one night, and the family doctor was summoned in a panic. For hours, the house buzzed with fear, servants rushing, Margaret weeping, siblings pacing. The hidden daughter watched from the shadows, her emotions tangled. Part of her wanted to step forward, to be seen, to show that she too was family, that she too had a stake in the man gasping for breath upstairs. But another part of her knew this moment could be the crack that shattered everything. When Jonathan recovered slightly, confined to bed, he became obsessed with writing. Pages piled up on his nightstand. Margaret tried to keep them hidden, but the daughter knew where to look. And one night when the house was still, she entered Jonathan's room. His breathing was ragged, his face pale. On the desk beside him lay the letter, unfinished, trembling handwriting spilling across the page. This time she read it fully. It was his complete confession. A document not just of her hidden existence, but of the Whitford family's rot. He wrote of deals built on exploitation, of lies told to maintain respectability, of betrayals that stretched back generations. He admitted that hiding her was not merely about race, but about what it revealed, the hypocrisy at the heart of their legacy. He confessed that he had been weak, that he had destroyed his own daughter's life to protect a name that was already corrupted. As she finished reading, something within her hardened. This was not just about a secret daughter anymore. This was about truth, the kind that destroys reputations, strips away facades, and rewrites legacies. And she knew the world had to see it. The Whitford estate had hosted countless grand occasions, galas glittering with chandeliers, fundraisers that lined their pockets with influence, family celebrations that cemented their image of perfection. But none carried the same fragile tension as Jonathan's 75th birthday. It was not only a milestone, but, as everyone in their elite circle knew, perhaps his last great public appearance. The mansion was dressed in its most dazzling form. White roses cascaded over silver vases. The chandeliers gleamed brighter than ever, and the Whitford siblings, polished like heirloom jewels, flanked their parents as photographers captured every angle. Guests whispered about Jonathan's frailty, his face thinner, his movement slower, but Margaret's smile worked overtime, a porcelain shield against pity. The hidden daughter watched it all from the shadows, her heart pounding like a drum of war. Tonight, she told herself, the silence would end. For 20 years, she had been a ghost haunting the mansion. Tonight, she would be flesh, blood, and undeniable truth. She carried with her Jonathan's confession, the letter that had burned her hands the moment she read it. Its words had given her more than validation. They had armed her with the weapon to dismantle the empire built on lies. But timing was everything. And as the speeches began, she knew the exact moment had arrived. Jonathan, propped up with effort, rose to deliver what would be his final toast. His voice, though frail, carried the same authority that once made boardrooms fall silent. He spoke of family, of legacy, of the pride he felt in his children and their futures. His words were rehearsed, polished, an echo of the Whitford myth he had spent a lifetime perfecting. Applause followed, reverent and sympathetic, a chorus of admiration for a man who had done it all. And then, silence. Into that silence stepped the daughter who was never meant to be seen. She walked through the crowd, her presence drawing startled gasps. Heads turned, whispers darted like fire through the room. She was neither servant nor guest. She carried herself with a dignity that demanded attention, and yet her face bore the features no one could place within the family's narrative. Margaret froze, her smile collapsing into horror. The siblings exchanged bewildered glances, their eyes wide with the sudden fracture of reality. Jonathan's glass slipped from his trembling hand, shattering against the floor. The daughter's voice cut through the murmurs, steady and unshaken. She held up the letter for all to see. "You've all celebrated a man of honor tonight," she said, her words sharp as glass. "But honor cannot exist where truth has been buried. For 20 years this family hid me, hid their own daughter, because my existence threatened the image you so proudly applaud." A ripple of shock tore through the guests. Cameras meant to capture elegance now swiveled toward scandal. The Whitfords' perfect mask cracked under the weight of her presence. She unfolded the letter and began to read. Jonathan's trembling handwriting filled the hall, his confession laid bare in her steady voice. Every line struck like a hammer. His admission of forcing Margaret into silence, his choice to erase his own child from existence, his acknowledgement that the Whitford legacy was built not on integrity but on lies. Gasps erupted. A senator's wife covered her mouth. A businessman muttered, "Dear God." The Whitford siblings, pale and trembling, looked at their father as though seeing him for the first time. Margaret collapsed into a chair, her composure gone, tears streaking her carefully painted face. Jonathan himself seemed to shrink, his shoulders collapsing inward, his eyes fixed not on the daughter before him, but on the floor. For the first time, the man who had commanded respect with every glance could not look anyone in the eye. But the daughter was not finished. She lowered the letter and looked directly at the crowd. "For 20 years I was hidden in the attic of this house. I grew up watching siblings I could not touch, hearing laughter I could not join, existing as a shadow in a family that chose shame over love. And why? Because of the color of my skin. Because their legacy mattered more than my life." The hall erupted. Some guests tried to leave, unwilling to be tainted by scandal. Others lingered, fascinated by the collapse of a dynasty before their eyes. Photographers snapped furiously, capturing not polished smiles, but unraveling truths. The Whitford name, once untouchable, was now drenched in disgrace. Margaret reached out a trembling hand, whispering her daughter's name. But the gesture was too late, too hollow. The siblings, raised in ignorance of her existence, could only stare in stunned silence, their futures suddenly altered by a sister they had never been allowed to know. Jonathan tried to rise, perhaps to speak, perhaps to defend himself. But his body betrayed him. His voice cracked into silence, and the letter in his daughter's hand spoke louder than anything he could say. The daughter stood tall, not with vengeance, but with liberation. For the first time, she was not invisible. She was undeniable. And in the collapse of the Whitford's perfect image, she claimed the power that had been stolen from her at birth. The gala ended not with applause, but with chaos. Guests scattering, reporters calling. The Whitford mansion, trembling under the weight of a secret, finally unleashed. The family's carefully constructed empire had shattered in a single night, and the world would never look at them the same way again. The night of Jonathan Whitford's birthday ended not in the glow of champagne and applause, but in fractured silence and shame. The grandeur of the mansion, the glittering chandeliers, the white roses, the polished marble floors, suddenly seemed less like a palace and more like a mausoleum, a tomb for a legacy that had just been buried. Guests slipped away quickly, whispering in horror and fascination, their departure leaving behind only shattered glass, discarded silverware, and the broken remains of a family exposed. The hidden daughter, no longer hidden, stood in the center of it all, her presence burning like a truth no one could ignore. For the first time, her existence was undeniable, not just to the family who had erased her, but to the world beyond those gates. She felt both liberated and raw, the weight of 20 years lifted yet replaced by the storm of consequences now rolling toward her. Jonathan Whitford, once the titan of control, collapsed into silence. The man who had built an empire on appearances now sat slumped, defeated by the very secret he had tried to contain. His confession, meant to unburden him privately, had become the torch that set fire to everything. He would never again command respect in boardrooms or be praised in glossy magazines. Instead, his name would be forever tied to hypocrisy, cowardice, and the cruelty of hiding his own child. Margaret, her flawless composure shattered, wept openly. For years she had been both accomplice and victim, silenced by her husband's iron will and by her own fear of losing the life she clung to. Now, with the world watching, her guilt could no longer be disguised. The whispers of sympathy she once inspired at society luncheons would transform into condemnation. To many, she was not just a mother trapped in a husband's cruelty, but a mother who had failed to protect her own child. The siblings, raised in ignorance of their sister's existence, found their world tilted beyond recognition. The hidden daughter they had never met was suddenly their equal, a living reminder that the perfection they had flaunted was built on exclusion and lies. Their futures, once guaranteed by the strength of the Whitford name, now seemed uncertain. Universities, employers, potential spouses, all would look at them differently. They were no longer heirs to a respected dynasty, but members of a disgraced household. The fallout spread quickly beyond the mansion. Newspapers seized on the scandal, their headlines unforgiving. Whitford legacy crumbles, hidden daughter emerges after 20 years. Talk shows dissected every detail, guests debating not just the family's cruelty, but what it revealed about wealth, race, and reputation in modern society. Old business partners distanced themselves, politicians declined calls, and charities quietly erased the Whitfords' names from their donor walls. The Whitford fortune remained, but money could no longer buy what had been lost: respect, admiration, influence. Their name had become a warning, a reminder of how secrets rot dynasties from the inside out. But while the Whitfords crumbled, the daughter found herself standing taller. For years, she had been invisible, her identity suppressed, her existence treated as a liability. Now she was not only seen but heard. Reporters sought her story. Advocates reached out, offering platforms to share her experience. She became a symbol of resilience, her voice carrying far beyond the walls that had confined her. At first, she hesitated. Exposure was overwhelming, cameras flashing, strangers knowing her face, the world dissecting her pain. But slowly she began to embrace it. She realized that by speaking, she was not only reclaiming her own life but also shining light for countless others who had been silenced by shame, control, or prejudice. Her truth had the power to ripple outward, to spark conversations far greater than the Whitfords' downfall, and so she spoke. She told of the attic room where she had grown up, of the nights spent listening to laughter downstairs, of the ache of being erased from family portraits. She spoke not with bitterness but with clarity, transforming her suffering into testimony. People listened, people wept, and in her words, many saw reflections of their own buried wounds. For Margaret, the impact was unbearable. She sought forgiveness, but forgiveness is not easily granted when silence has lasted decades. She tried to visit her daughter, to explain the fear that had kept her complicit, to offer love that should have been unconditional. But every attempt was met with the same steady response. "I needed you then, not now." The words cut, but they were true. Margaret was left to live with the weight of what she had chosen and what she had sacrificed. Jonathan never recovered from the humiliation. His health, already fragile, declined swiftly. He spent his final months in quiet seclusion. The empire he had built reduced to nothing more than property papers and fading photographs. On his deathbed, he asked to see his daughter. She came, not out of duty, but out of her own strength. She listened as he tried to apologize, his voice weak, his eyes hollow. And though she could not give him absolution, she gave him something more powerful. The truth that she had survived despite him, that she had become more than the shadow he tried to make her. When he passed, she felt no grief, only release. In the years that followed, the Whitford mansion stood as a relic of collapse. Its walls, once symbols of pride, became silent witnesses to the cost of secrets. The siblings scattered, each attempting to rebuild lives unshackled from their surname, though none would ever fully escape the stain of scandal. Margaret, older and frailer, withdrew from society, her name no longer welcomed at the luncheons she once ruled. She lived with her regret as constant company, but the daughter's life bloomed. No longer confined, she carved her own path: education, work, relationships, each step taken in freedom she had been denied for so long. She wrote her story, not to dwell in pain, but to ensure it would never be silenced again. Her book became more than a memoir. It was a manifesto for truth, dignity, and the courage to break chains of secrecy, and people listened. Young women hidden by oppressive families, children silenced by shame, voices long suppressed. They found strength in her story. She had taken the cruelty inflicted upon her and transformed it into a light for others. The Whitford legacy did not survive, but perhaps that was its rightful fate. For legacies built on lies are destined to crumble, no matter how many walls are built to protect them. In the end, the daughter stood not as a victim but as a testament that truth, though buried, cannot be destroyed. That secrets, no matter how deeply locked away, will rise, and that the power of one voice, long silenced, can echo louder than a dynasty. The Whitfords had hidden her for 20 years, but in revealing herself, she ensured that her story, and the lesson it carried, would never be hidden again.